Thank you very much. So I'm an economist. That means I'm the kind of expert who doesn't know what he's talking about. But I'm going to make you feel, ladies and gentlemen, as if that's your fault. Thank you for that. Thank you for that kind introduction. It's a pleasure to follow John Redwood. There aren't many soaring intellects in British public life, actually, certainly not in the House of Commons. John Redwood, Fellow of All Souls, formerly of St Anthony's College, Oxford as well, where I was proud to study, is certainly one of them, and it's a pleasure to follow him. It's also a pleasure to be here. Generally, when I get up on my hind legs and talk about Brexit, I'm hissed at, I'm booed, I'm what's called subtweeted by passive-aggressive reporters from papers that aren't white. And that's only in the kitchen. But seriously, it's very nice to be here. I think it's the duty of somebody with the privilege of writing a column in a place like the Sunday Telegraph and elsewhere where I write columns to roll your sleeves up, get involved, take part in public debates, put your views on the line and face the consequences, and that's what I try to do in my life. So first, ladies and gentlemen, they said we were too thick to know what we were voting for. Then they said we were racist. On top of that, they said that those of us who voted to leave the European Union were too old. Anything to discredit the biggest act of democracy in British history. Now they have a new excuse, don't they? The Brexit vote had nothing to do with the overbearing EU, the reams of regulation, the anti-democratic diktats, the hundreds of billions of pounds that we've sent to Brussels since 1973. It had nothing to do with the desire of a seemingly independent nation to re-empower its democratically elected lawmakers by taking back control in that great phrase of our laws, our borders and our money. Nothing at all. Now we're told, endlessly, our airwaves full of the message, morning, noon and night over the last week, now we're told that those of us who voted for Brexit were manipulated by online propaganda, funded by cheating and overspending. Now the timings of these revelations, of this path-breaking journalism, they have nothing to do with the fact that the EU withdrawal bill is at a crucial stage in the House of Lords. Total coincidence. It's completely unrelated to the fact that the government, despite the European Commission's efforts, has lately had actually some decent progress to report on our Article 50 negotiations, with agreements on citizens' rights and increasing signs of bilateral deals on the horizon with non-EU nations once we leave. It was all the fault of social media. That's what swung the referendum in Leave's favour, even though those older voters, it was your fault, are already on social media anyway. And it was the Leave side spending more than Remain. Even though the Electoral Commission's own figures show that Remain spent 16.1 million and Leave spent 13.4. Remain channelled 1.1 million of that to so-called satellite campaigning organisations, legally within the rules, organisations such as Best for Our Future and the In Crowd, all of them set up in the last few weeks before June the 23rd, 2016, as the establishment panicked and realised that for all their efforts, the British people, in their wisdom and courage, were capable of making up their own mind and rationally, independently voting to quit the European Union. Yes, the Leave side also paid money to satellite campaign groups, again, entirely within the rules, an amount of 670,000 compared to 1.1 million, less than 2/3 of the total spent by those opposing Brexit. So, Remain spent 20% more than Leave overall, 16.1 million compared to 13.4 million. And it spent a lot more on those satellites that are now being presented as shadowy. And then we must remember that the Cameron and Osborne government, in addition to those numbers I just gave you, spent 9 million more producing, posting and then digitally promoting the leaflet, the neutral leaflet, and this is just for information, honestly, titled, neutrally, Why the government believes voting to remain in the EU is the best decision for the UK. If you study that leaflet, as Jared Lyons and I did in Clean Brexit in detail, it presents an extremely one-sided and in some places completely misleading case for Remain. And that leaflet, with cynical timing, unbelievably cynical timing, was sent just days before the government's pre-referendum purdah period kicked in. As such, the cost of producing and distributing a wholly pro-Remain mail shot with the coat of arms of the British government at the top was met from general taxation, ladies and gentlemen, not counting as part of the specific and equal state funding that was earmarked for both sides. As such, leave was not only heavily outspent during the referendum campaign, ladies and gentlemen, it began with a £9 million disadvantage. Considers that the entire machinery of government, of course, all those Treasury dodgy dossiers with their immediate and profound economic shocks, and the 800,000 job losses following a Brexit vote. Fact, said George Osborne on Newsnight. Fact, said George Osborne on the 6 o'clock news. And then on the Today programme the next day, and then the day after that as well. It doesn't include the fact that the Foreign Office, of course, urged the then President of the United States to warn the entire country when it came to trading with the country that's already our biggest single country trading partner, that we will be at the back of the queue post-Brexit. Then, of course, there was the CBI, TUC, and all the other self-serving, useless acronyms wedded to the status quo. Their every utterance reported breathlessly across the bulletins, on a loop, as hard-hitting, path-breaking news. So let us consider a year from Brexit Day, ladies and gentlemen, that despite all those warnings, despite all that effort by the establishment, 17.4 million British people still voted for Brexit. They knew what they were voting for, and their votes are every bit as important as all those who voted Remain. In a fair contest, showing immense wisdom, the British public voted Leave, which speaks volumes about this country's remaining capacity, no pun intended, for independent thought and critical thinking. So away with your bitter nonsense, Remoaners. Grow up and accept the results of this democratic referendum. Let's acknowledge that the campaign to reverse Brexit is in full swing. Let us acknowledge that the UK's negotiations are now subject to full-scale wrecking tactics, and there's no doubt more to come. Political and corporate interests determined to upend the 2016 referendum are seeking to renege on the outcome of the Brexit vote. Jeremy Corbyn clearly wants to leave the European Union. He opposed membership of the European Economic Community in the 1975 referendum, and as an MP he voted against Maastricht and then the Lisbon Treaty in 2009. Yet the Labour leader now, despite his much vaunted principles, says he wants to stay in a customs union with the EU, contradicting his own party's manifesto of June 2017. For Corbyn, all that matters is causing chaos and toppling the government. Whatever the cost to this country, that's about the only thing on which Momentum and the party's Blairite rump can now agree. What do they care that the customs union puts a tariff wall around the entire EU, imposing charges on exports from the rest of the world? That means, of course, that UK shoppers pay more, particularly on food, clothing and footwear, goods accounting for a high share of our poorer households' incomes, and often to protect inefficient EU producers elsewhere. Some 80% of those tariff revenues are then sent automatically and directly to Brussels, a fact I am yet to hear mentioned on a mainstream news bulletin in this country. And because the UK has a higher share of non-EU trade than other large EU members, we get a uniquely bad deal from being inside this protectionist customs union. Yes, the customs union means there are no tariff barriers within the EU, which we're often told is vital to protect complex supply chains. But such tariffs generally only apply to finished goods, ladies and gentlemen, not components. And outside the customs union, frictionless trade is still possible under a UK-EU free trade agreement, if and when we get one. Customs union membership apparently means we benefit from the EU's 60+ free trade agreements with other nations, or 76 if you're operating Alistair Campbell's Twitter account. How often is the public told? How often are we told that only 30 of these agreements are actually ratified and in force? Some are with sizable countries, yes, like South Korea and Mexico, both economies that said they now want bilateral bespoke deals with the UK. But most of the EU's trade deals are actually with minnows and microstates. All the EU's trade deals added up cover 8% of the global economy. The EU is very bad at negotiating trade deals because member states' interests so often conflict. That's why after years of trying, there's no EU free trade agreement with the US, China, India, or any really large economy, ladies and gentlemen. The UK has a much better chance of securing deals with those big economies negotiating alone. We're a sizable economy. Even Switzerland, which is 18th in the world compared to our 5th in terms of size, signed a free trade agreement with China in 2014 after 14 months of negotiation. This is doable, and deals cut by London will favour sectors where Britain is strong, such as services, rather than being skewed towards French and German interests as EU free trade agreements so often are. Now, when the UK joined the EEC in the early 1970s, the bloc accounted for 30% of global GDP. Once we've left, it'll be just 15% of global GDP, despite the EU now comprising more than 4 times more member states. The direction of travel is clear. It makes no sense for a diverse, competitive economy like ours to be behind a tariff wall that harms our consumers and discriminates against the 85% of the world economy that's outside the EU. Mr. Corbyn, you should remember that, and at the same time that will leave us unable to cut those bespoke trade agreements that we need with the world's largest markets, where the growth is, where we need to be trading more and more to secure the prosperity of our children and our grandchildren. The CBI recently claimed its case to stay in the EU, in the customs union, was about facts and not ideology. They claim that you can stay in the customs union, quotes, while respecting the vote to leave the EU. That's absolute, abject nonsense. The EU began life as a customs union. It's what it is. The mechanism enshrined in the 1957 Treaty of Rome. And it's an honour to be in the room with pretty much the only person who's read it. Customs union membership embodies the essence of EU membership. We must remember organisations like the CBI exist to protect the interests of the large corporate incumbents, that want the status quo. They never want any change. Leaving the customs union, though, would help those dynamic smaller firms with bespoke UK trade agreements, helping them export to a much broader range of markets. So, Mr. Corbyn, you're aligning yourself with big corporate interests at the expense of British shoppers and genuine British entrepreneurs. You're backing a customs union that blocks both low-value and high-value exports from some of the poorest countries on earth. How progressive is that? Mindful of the billions of pounds of tariff revenue we send to Brussels each year, of course, the European Commission is determined to keep Britain inside its ghastly customs union. But the UK would then be obliged to impose EU tariffs without being able to influence them. Despite opting for Brexit, the British government wouldn't have control of our money laws and trade, as voters were told, if we stay inside this customs union. And of course, Corbyn's recent volte-face on the customs union was timed to coincide with the throwing of what one Brussels insider glibly dubbed, with apparently no understanding of history, quotes, a hand grenade aimed at the British Parliament. Talking about the Irish border, a hand grenade aimed at the British government. The EU tried deliberately to destabilise the UK by issuing a draft treaty rendering operational plans to create a border in the Irish Sea, effectively splitting Northern Ireland from the rest of the UK. This incendiary outcome can only be avoided, Brussels tell us, its words repeated as gospel by UK broadcasters, if Britain stays in the EU's customs union. The Prime Minister made her opposition very quickly crystal clear, quotes. David Davis threatened to withhold UK cash unless the EU backs down over Northern Ireland's border. They were right to do so. For this Irish border issue, and it is a subject close to my heart, this Irish border issue is being cynically and irresponsibly hijacked by both the Commission and its ultra-Remain acolytes here in the UK in an attempt to frighten the British public and make Brexit seem impossible and irresponsible. The very light border between the North and the Irish public already copes, the existing border already copes with different currencies, excise duties and other tax rates. The UK government has established, as detailed in an August 2017 paper, that post-Brexit there's no need for the kind of physical border checks that could inflame sectarian sensitivities. The head of HMRC himself has made clear no border is necessary, as has his Irish equivalent. Even a European Commission paper published in November 2017 accepted there was no need for physical border posts. Technology and cameras would be sufficient. Cameras which actually, if you know that part of the world, you will know already exist on approaches to the Irish border. Despite all that, the European Commission continues flatly to reject any common sense solution. So keen is it to mess with the precious Northern Ireland peace process, to put pressure on May. Because when it comes to the Irish border, ladies and gentlemen, Brussels isn't looking for a solution. Brussels is looking for a weapon. What kind of an organisation deliberately frustrates a government seeking to implement the democratic will of its people? What kind of people seek to aggravate ancient cross-border enmities so greatly improved in recent years but still so fragile just because a nation wants to leave the European Union? I want to talk a little bit about no deal. Jerry and I talked a lot about no deal in our policy exchange paper of December 2016, which came out before Lancaster House. And in Clean Brexit, our book, which was published in September 2017, we developed a lot of these arguments. Now, it's my view, while like John Redwood, I would absolutely want a free trade agreement between the European Union and the UK as quickly as we possibly can, I am forced to conclude, given where we are now, given all the foot dragging over money and sequencing and Northern Ireland by the Commission, I'm forced to conclude that the most likely outcome of our Article 50 negotiations now, in my view, is that we leave in March 2019 with no deal. That's the most likely. Not least given the Commission's overwhelming interest in discouraging others from leaving, so retaining its vast, chronically mismanaged budget. I don't want there to be no deal, but that is the most likely outcome. That's why my book with Jerry says Britain needs to prepare, both politically, practically, and psychologically, to trade with the EU under WTO rules. Happily, ladies and gentlemen, that is, quotes, perfectly manageable, despite what you often read and hear on the airwaves. Now, who said that? Not me, not John Redwood. Perfectly manageable, the UK trading with the EU under WTO rules, was the exact phrase used, and I have the recording, by Roberto Azevedo, who is the Director General of the WTO, the world's most senior trade diplomat, who I went to Geneva to interview late last year. Perfectly manageable. An EU free trade agreement is clearly preferable. But even though it's preferable, relatively low WTO tariffs, which the EU will probably impose on us, and we can choose whether or not to impose on them, we don't have to, won't stop cross-channel trade. Remember Anna Soubry said trade outside the EU would fall absolutely almost to zero? The standard bearer. No, I must be rude, even though she's rude about me. And if Britain does impose tariffs on EU imports under WTO rules, and that's our choice, guess what? The Treasury will be several £billion better off. Trading with no free trade agreement will disrupt some industries at the outset. I fully accept that. But these net tariff revenues, £4, £5, £6 billion, depending on the calculations that you do and the assumptions that you make, these net tariff revenues could be used to ease these sector difficulties, should the government so choose. Britain already trades under WTO rules. We mustn't be scared with the US, our biggest single country trading partner. The majority of our trade, in fact, is outside the EU, largely under WTO rules. Such non-EU trade, as John said, is fast growing and generates a surplus, adding to the UK's national wealth. Our EU trade, in contrast, is shrinking and records an annual deficit, subtracting from our prosperity. And if single market and customs union membership for working for Britain, ladies and gentlemen, that quite simply wouldn't be the case. Now clearly, post-Brexit Britain must and will continue to trade extensively with the EU. I hope we do sign what the Prime Minister called a bold and ambitious free trade agreement with the EU. But despite our best efforts, I can't see such a deal being agreed, let alone ratified by 27 EU nations and the European Parliament, Guy Verhofstadt's keen, before next March. And that may actually be no bad thing. What's most important is securing a trade deal that's good for Britain in the long term. If we had a bad trade deal in a panic with the European Union, we're stuck with it for a generation. Negotiating against a hard deadline, be it March 2019 or December 2020, the end of the implementation period, allows the EU to impose far tougher terms. Doing a trade deal once the Brexit dust has settled may make more sense, but only as long as we're prepared for that WTO fallback position. Once the visceral politics of these Brexit talks are over, the UK's left and the world hasn't stopped turning. Those continental commercial lobbies that also want a good EU-UK free trade agreement, the German car makers, the French food producers and so on, they should be able to better sideline the ghastly Commission and via their national governments and their voters get their voices heard. We must recognise, ladies and gentlemen, no deal as an entirely satisfactory outcome. Secondly, we need to spend money visibly on preparing for no deal, customs facilities and so on, making preparations that in many cases we need to make anyway. The government must actively reassure the public and warn Brussels that steps are being taken to ensure smooth customs and border arrangements after 29th of March next year, whatever the outcome of these talks. That means spending money, and it was a major missed opportunity, I'm afraid, that such words weren't heard in the Chancellor's spring statement when the world was watching. The new CDS customs IT systems, it's anyway thankfully well advanced. It will need to be adapted for conditions outside the customs union. We need to tell the world that that is happening. Physical infrastructure will need to be constructed at our ports and airports. Customs and border forces will need to be recruited and trained. Money has been set aside, we're told. We need to see visibly that it's being spent to prepare for no deal. And anything else is to completely undermine our own negotiating position. Now, no one is advocating a failure to settle administrative issues with the EU under no deal, such as mutual recognition agreements on goods, aircraft landing rights and all the rest of it. Now, these existing and entirely uncontroversial protocols already extend to countless non-EU members from the EU and are often nothing to do with the EU anyway, so they can be solved. No deal doesn't mean chaos. No deal simply means we trade with the EU under WTO rules, as we trade with the US, as most of the world trades with most of the world. That's the regime covering most of our existing trade, as I said, and most trade between all countries everywhere. It's not essential to strike an EU free trade agreement by March 2019 or by December 2020, and failing to grasp that is a major strategic error. So, in sum, semantics are important. Language is important. Leaving the single market and the customs union, ladies and gentlemen, isn't hard Brexit, it's Brexit. The benefits of the UK being inside both these legal arrangements are enormously overstated across much of the mainstream media, and the drawbacks are systematically downplayed to the point of very rarely being mentioned, if at all. The government simply must stick to the Prime Minister's plans as outlined in the Lancaster House speech, and then again in Florence and at the Mansion House. To stay in the single market, the customs union, or both, would leave the UK in an extremely weak position and be a betrayal of the Brexit referendum. And for my final point, I absolutely join with John here. It's high time that ministers, whichever way they voted in the referendum, make a concerted and sustained effort to highlight to the entire country, to the EU and to the world, the advantages of being outside of the European Union. Far from being a cross to bear, Brexit is a huge opportunity for the UK. The tough process of leaving, ladies and gentlemen, made deliberately tougher by the European Commission, is temporary and will soon be over. The benefits of regaining our sovereignty and raising our sights beyond the EU to the world, they're permanent. Thank you.